Thank you for joining me at the Next Big Idea Club, powered by Heleo. I'm excited to talk about your book, The Art of Gathering. It's a wonderful book.
Also.
I have to say, I'm going to jump right into it. You know, I think it's really easy for just a casual observer to underestimate sort of the significance of gatherings. I know that when I first heard the title, I thought, oh, that's cool, that's a neat idea. And then I started reading it, and I was really impressed. I mean, it reaches into like every interaction, essentially. Oh, our network connection's
The
better.
challenge of this um, challenge of the book um, was to figure out how to get people to take these ideas seriously, and as seriously as the power of gathering actually is. And I think that in part we have started to associate gathering too closely with the idea of the dinner party. And it's not that dinner parties aren't wonderful, and I spend a lot of time in the book talking about how to transform your dinner party. But I think it's dangerous when we associate something as human as the word gathering with an archetype of a somewhat kind of elite, only social, very specific type of coming together. And so I set out to write this book, and I specifically chose a lot of areas of complication, of heat, of power, to see how people came together when the outcome really matters. So, for example, I look at the New York Times page one meeting and how Dean Baquet, the new executive editor, changed kind of how the journalists and the editors meet when the page one of the New York Times is no longer as important as the homepage. How do you actually restructure a meeting that for 70 years has been kind of the iconic meeting of that paper to figure out what's going to go on the front page of, at some level, the news of the world? The rituals of that meeting no longer match the need of the paper. I look at courthouses in Brooklyn where they began to see that the proceedings, the way that the courtroom was structured, the way that people, the lawyers and the defendants and the judges were actually interacting, weren't actually reducing crime. And so this group, the Red Hook Community Justice Center, stepped back to ask, what is the purpose of court? And that's a radical question. And so I wrote this book to basically say, when we come together, how we come together drastically impacts outcomes that affect the way we, construct society.
Absolutely. Once you start examining these gatherings, you start to realize how there's an element of ritual to them, which is very deep and can also be hard to change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I thought, but there's also a real comfort in it too. I thought that one of the things you do so well in the book is you encourage people to sort of I don't want to say reboot, although I just did, to sort of update their rituals to things that are more relevant to their current lives, right? So you take something, and people do it all the time, right? With wedding vows. Wedding vows have changed. But even in a more, weddings are ideally once a lifetime. So even things that are more like a weekly basis or a monthly basis.
Mm-hmm. There's a very, very fine line between routine and ritual. And meaningful ritual, when it matches the purpose of the gathering, is extraordinarily powerful. And meaningless routine, when it no longer serves the original purpose or the modern purpose of a gathering, becomes extraordinarily frustrating. And one of the examples that I gave in our interview earlier was the royal wedding. To me, it's this example of this old ritual that could become, if repeated in the exact same way as a gathering, basically the same dress, walking up the same aisle, hearing the same words from the clergy with the same music. At some point, anyone who's moved on in the world kind of rolls their eyes. The reason, at least for many in the world, and for me, that the Meghan Markle, wedding was so moving was because there was deep, deep, deep innovation within a consistent form. Like inviting an American Black pastor to give a sermon, to invite a chorus to sing old gospels that acknowledge that this woman is biracial in a very staid white British royalty is actually made the world watch and remember and transform and symbolize a gathering that says we both know our roots and we can modernize.
Right. In a way, it gets a little bit to the heart of, or one of the hearts of art, which is you take the familiar and then you reinvent it, or you reinvigorate it with sort of a more modern, current approach.
Completely. One of the I interviewed a tea master in Japan, and one of the things that I began to learn as I looked at tea ceremonies in Japan was the vast range of ritual in even tea ceremonies in Japan, and that there are kind of within that world enormous fights about what consists a tea ceremony. A friend of mine went to a tea ceremony where the entire thing was done to metallic kind of radical music. And there were some people in the tea ceremony world that says that is no longer a tea ceremony. And there's other in the world that says, wow, they are actually preserving the art by modernizing it. And in all companies, in all businesses, understanding the discernment of what is it that allows you to honor your roots and what is it that allows you to refresh for the modern time and modern era and the market need, that by doing that, you're actually preserving your foundation.
Wow, that's fascinating. So I'm curious about modern, since we're talking about refreshing and changing things. It seems like so many things are now virtual and increasingly so. Like, for example, our conversation.
Yeah.
20 years ago, we would sit down like somewhere and I would interview you. But now it's over. And I find it particularly challenging because I feel like I'm very reliant upon body cues and tone of voice and gestures, all these things. And when I think of something like as mundane, excuse me, as a conference call for work, they are, for me, they're profoundly awkward.
Yeah.
Where when you never know when they're over, especially if it's just a call, you're like, so is everybody good? And everybody's like, yes or no. Nobody wants to close it in case someone else is. And is this the kind of thing where you feel like the etiquette is still being created, or I don't know? Is it? I'm just wondering like how you see it because you're so well versed in sort of all the various interactions and etiquettes of different group gatherings.
I think we are still figuring out modern etiquette for virtual gatherings. And I think one of the principles that I think of in virtual gatherings is how can you make them as human as possible? So for example, if you're on a conference call and there's multiple people on the calls, in any gathering, the first 5% and the last 5% disproportionately matter, kind of how you open and how you close. And one of the chapters in the Art of Gathering is never start a funeral with logistics. I use an extreme example, but you should never start a conference call with logistics. You should never start a conference with logistics. And so, and you should start it with your purpose and by connecting the group. So an example on a conference call, if you're having a morning call, I'm making this up, but you could do it any way you wanted, is to ask everybody to make sure that they have a warm cup of something that they bring in a mug or a glass. And then at the beginning, just say, hey, if we could check in, just let us know where you are. And what does your mug say? And some people say my mug is, it's the one that I grabbed out of the WeWork space. And other people may say, actually, my mug says raising tiny humans is exhausting. Mm-hmm. And I have a mug that says that. And by doing that, I'm actually telling you a lot about my life, but I'm also reminding you that I'm a physical human being and I'm drinking tea or I'm drinking cappuccino. And it's a very, very quick way of getting kind of the body into the space.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. That embodiment, it's true. It's very easy to it just becomes this empty voice.
Yes. And I think the other thing with conference calls is in any gathering, power lies somewhere. In a conference call, power lies in the mute button, particularly from the host. Sort of what do you mute when you turn people off, when you turn their ability to speak on or off. A couple of years ago, the organization Move On hosted a conference call. I heard about it because when you study these things, people tell you these things. I wasn't on it. And it was right after the election, and 60,000 people called in.
Wow.
And the organizers, I'm told, in the opening said, we have 60,000 people on this call, and everyone obviously was probably amazed by that. And then they did something kind of radical. They said, we're going to turn off the mute button, and we want you all to say hello. and it just at the same time. And, you get chills down your spine. Whatever the purpose of it for, you have 60,000 people, and they gave them an opportunity to give voice. And it transformed, the memory of the call.
That's incredible. I mean, just as a moment of communal gathering.
Yes. Who are we? We are all here. And I think in any type of virtual gatherings, there are still ways to help people understand we are all here.
Mm-hmm. To get to the idea, I know that you cover lots of different kinds of gatherings. I literally just went to a dinner party last night, so it's very top of mind. And I did want to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So one of them was, you talk about, as a host, don't be a chill host. That's one of your chapters where you say, and the tendency, and I know I have the tendency when we host on our side, is to just, you kind of introduce everyone, you say, this is this person, and she does this, and she's great. And then you just like, now do your thing, right? And you expect people, but your position is that, in fact, hosts need to be much more involved and need to guide it more. And why is that? Because I would worry that it would feel a little too orchestrated or a little bit like you're at camp, as opposed to like trusting people to just have natural conversations emerge.
So what I say is, I say don't be a chill host. And what I mean by that is that every gathering every time two or more people come together, there is power in the room. By definition, power is not a bad thing. It's the negotiation of, at the simplest level, who speaks when, or if there's a decision to be made, how do you make it? Who is going to sit where? Do you leave it to your guests, or do you put little name cards so that they don't have to negotiate? And so it's not so much that I say, I don't think you should be involved and orchestrating every single part of it. I think that you should get very clear on what your purpose is. And then as a host, you should protect your guests and the purpose. You should equalize them, and you should connect them. And you need to do that in a way that's organic to you. So in some gatherings, introducing people at the very beginning or setting one rule and then letting them be might make sense. But if somebody starts cornering a guest, or if somebody starts misbehaving, or somebody at a dinner party gets too drunk or dominating conversation, what I'm saying is, when you're hosting, you're not an equal to the guests. It's your job to take care of it, because you're not protecting everybody else. A rule for a gathering that I love, this is from Anthony Rocco, an experience designer in San Francisco, that he uses when he was planning different secret society kind of events that he shared with me, which is have one rule at the beginning of your dinner party. That's you welcome, come in. The only rule tonight is you can't serve yourself a drink. You can only serve other people a drink. Do that, and things change. Find ways that are not awkward, that are not cheesy, that don't feel like camp, that's culturally appropriate, to get people to connect in a meaningful way.
That's great. I like that. I was at a party held by a friend, and he did a thing which I'd never seen, where there were maybe 12 people, and we sat down, and he said, okay, turn to the person to your right or left or whatever, and you talk to them, and then you would have to introduce them to the group. And, just a short 30-second, she does this, she's wonderful. And I liked it. I thought it was kind of, because I'm fairly introverted, so that one-on-one interaction was more appealing to me. But then when you share it with a group, you start hearing all these things. It's also interesting to hear yourself introduced, which is a little,
Absolutely.
like how you come across.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and that felt like a pleasant and yet sincere, sort of authentic thing, as opposed to other parties I've been to where it ends up just going way too long, and then you just feel like it takes half an hour to introduce people.
Yeah. And I write about in the book. I am a conflict resolution facilitator. I'm trained in dialogue and in group dynamics, and I still get it wrong. I still mess it up. So I write this book as much as a student, as a kind of as a guide, which is, you need to figure out your purpose. And when if the purpose of that dinner party that you went to last night, or that your friend hosted, if he did an opening exercise that matched that purpose, it probably felt good to you. Whereas when people kind of do an exercise that takes too long or feels kind of tacky in some way, you don't have the legitimacy or buy-in of the group. And so the same thing could work in one context and not work in another. So in some ways, the art of gathering it's not a prescription. It's basically saying, know why you're gathering these people, make it specific, and then find a way to help them be more comfortable with each other. One rule that I've seen employed more and more is no small talk. And there's an article in, I think, Wired UK by Dan Ariely, and another co-writer, a woman, I'm forgetting her name right now, who they talk about why is small talk a ritual and why is it actually preventing us from connecting with one another. And I know a host in California who hosts a lot of gatherings named Ali, and he before a number of his gatherings, sends an invitation and links to that article and has a rule. The only rule for tonight is no small talk. And so he primes people ahead of time to kind of start getting ready to realize, like, okay, so what do I actually talk about if I'm not allowed to talk about that? But he backs it in his case with science, because these people don't really want, for example, like a feel good, touchy feely, new agey thing. This needs to be science. And so he knows his audience. And so you need to gather in a way where you have the legitimacy of your group, and at some level, not being a chill host is being generous to your group so that you're not leaving them hanging out to dry.
Right. That's a great strategy. I love that. I want to track down that article.
I'll send it to you.
I just have a couple last questions, and then I'll let you go. One was, do you you focus a lot on the endings of things, which I thought was really fascinating, because it's true. You read an entire book and you remember like that opening scene, and then you remember like how it all comes together. So my question is, how do you create endings that are relevant and resonant, and yet don't feel, I guess, I don't want to say sentimental, but sort of like overly orchestrated? I mean, I know that's a very general question, and probably every situation is different, but just any sort of guidelines that might help people.
Yeah. The first is just very simply have an end. Don't just let your gathering stop. And what I mean by that is, when you kind of think about a lot of gatherings, they sort of peter out. At some point, we'll just kind of get up and leave, or conferences that end and say, okay, the buses, again, they end on logistics, just like they begin on logistics. Mm-hmm. And so the ending doesn't have to be overly formal or orchestrated. It just simply means taking the time to close it. So one of my improv teachers is named Dave Sawyer. He's based in Boston, and he would always say, you can tell a good actor by the way they get on the stage. You can tell a great actor by the way they leave. Good actors think desperately about how do they open, and then they kind of slump off at the end because they think their part is over. Great actors understand that the exit also matters. And it could be as simply as a dinner party, walking your guests to the door rather than letting them walk themselves out. It doesn't have to be this kind of overly formal thing. All I'm saying is that this closing also matters. People remember the final parts of the experience. It could be a toast where you kind of recall a few moments of the night that made people laugh, or what you learned. It could be, if you're a coach at the end of a game, ending with, we begin with like, let's go team, to end with the similar ritual. So have your rituals match the context so that, again, it doesn't feel cheesy. But people need to be held. I think of gatherings as a temporary alternative world, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as you think about anything you're inviting people into, whether it's a conference, a boardroom, or an office, you think about how do they open, how do they come into the room, and are you greeting them? And then when they leave, how do you help them? How do you help them re-enter into the world they went back into? The last thing is you can give them something that, I have a 3-year-old son, and he's part of a music class, and his teacher is named Jesse Goldman. He's a wonderful musician in Brooklyn. At the end of every class, he never ends with logistics. He strums the first note of the guitar of the last final song. It's a goodbye song. Everyone sings goodbye and names all the kids. But he strums the first note. He then says the logistics, give me your checks, no class next week. And then he continues to sing the song, ends on the song, and then he comes out and he says, who wants a stamp? And all the kids fly towards him, stamp on their hand. He's marking them, and then they leave. And for the rest of the day, everybody else knows, oh, they were at Jesse Goldman's Musica class. And I use this as a simple example, but he follows it. He understands the power of endings, and also having them leave it with a mark in some way. In this case, it's physical. So when they leave, they've been musica'd.
That's fantastic. So how should we end this call? I guess it's up to me. I'm a poor host to ask you. You're the guest.
I'll just say this book is called the Art of Gathering. It's not called the Art of Hosting. And I believe in part because I think guests have incredible power, and incredible subversive power. If you see something that's not going well, help in subtle ways. Help your host out. We guest much more often than we host, and you can actually transform a gathering through guesting. Okay, so I love to end with the chapter titles because they are full of tips, but they also embody what I believe about ending. So, The Art of Gathering. Chapter 1. Decide why you're really gathering. Chapter 2. Close doors. Chapter 3. Don't be a chill host. Chapter 4. Create a temporary alternative world. Chapter 5, never start a funeral with logistics. 6, keep your best self out of my gathering. 7, cause good controversy. And 8, accept that there is an end. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me.